A shocking discovery amidst the sweltering summer heat. In the blistering heat of July 2022, the residents of a modern, high-rise apartment complex in Manhattan, New York, were struggling as usual with the unyielding summer. It was one of those days where the air conditioning seemed to barely hold up against the oppressive heat, and the residents went about their routines with a bit more agitation than usual. However, something far more unsettling than a power outage or malfunctioning elevators was about to rock their lives. For weeks there had been whispers among the neighbors about an unusual putrid smell emanating from the basement level of the building. Initially it was dismissed as some spoiled garbage that had failed to make it to the dumpsters, or perhaps a rodent problem somewhere in the dark labyrinth of the building's underground storage and utility spaces. It wasn't uncommon in an otherwise luxury building to have the occasional breakdown in waste management, but this was different. As the days dragged on, the smell grew worse, sharp, pungent, and deeply unnatural. It clung to the air and filled the elevator shafts, seeping even into the higher floors. By the second week, residents began avoiding the basement parking lot entirely, opting to walk an extra block to street parking instead. The building managers promised they'd look into the issue. But all that seemed to take shape was the placement of a few industrial fans in futile attempts to circulate the air. Then it happened. On one unbearably hot afternoon, a tenant returning from work stumbled upon what he described as a revolting gelatinous mass near one of the basement vents. It took a moment for him to process what he was seeing: fleshy chunks, slick with congealed fat, mixed with strands of hair and an odor so vile that it immediately brought tears to his eyes. Confused and horrified, he backed away and called out to the first maintenance worker he could find. The commotion in the basement quickly erupted into hushed panic among the building's residents. News of the gruesome discovery spread like wildfire over building group chats, and curious tenants started making their way downstairs to look for themselves. Before long, the basement became a crowded, uneasy gathering of neighbors trying to make sense of what was emerging from the vents. Their questions bore the same chilling tone. What could this even be? And, is it an animal or worse? No one wanted to voice their darkest fears, but no one could shake the same gnawing thought. The building superintendent, a grizzled man who had seen plenty of unpleasant things during his years on the job, tried to calm everyone down. But even he looked pale when one of the tenants held up a piece of what they'd found. Cartilage-like fragments tangled in a horrifying mix of bloody residue and decomposition. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. "We need to call someone," yelled a woman clutching her toddler on her hip. Her voice was sharp with fear. "No, this can't be what we think it is," another neighbor muttered, shaking his head furiously, as though denying the possibility could will it out of existence. But soon, the conjectures turned louder. By the time the police were contacted, no one doubted something sinister was at play under their feet, hidden somewhere within the very pipes and shadows that connected their homes. What was being dumped into the building's drainage system? And more importantly, by whom? The first patrol officers to arrive at the scene didn't bother masking their unease as they surveyed the grim findings. They cordoned off the area and ordered the residents to leave the basement immediately, while crime scene investigators were summoned. When the investigators arrived, they donned gloves and masks to retrieve the mysterious fleshy materials for analysis. Some of the residue picked up backed the allegations of something undeniably organic but deeply suspect. Public statements were carefully avoided, but tension mounted as a forensic van quickened the scene. News media could sense the unease and began camping outside the building as rumors swirled around social media. Some speculated it was an illegal butcher operation, while others whispered darker theories involving the disposal of human remains. And then, there were the few residents who admitted, in hushed tones, that they'd heard peculiar noises late at night in the weeks leading up to the discovery. Muffled thuds, running water at odd hours, strange smells coming from the pipes. One elderly man even claimed he'd awoken to his bathroom sink, gurgling blood, though many dismissed his account as the overheated imagination of a secluded tenant. Still, as the samples were taken for testing, so too was the collective peace of everyone living in the building. In one of the world's busiest cities under the cover of sweltering summer nights, had a killer completed their work undetected? Did the answers lie within the very framework of their home? Authorities, step in. The investigation begins. The pungent smell and grotesque discovery in the apartment's basement had already sent shockwaves through its tenants, but when law enforcement arrived, the sense of dread grew palpably thicker. The New York Police Department dispatched a small team of patrol officers to secure the scene. Their response at first seemed routine, a possible illegal dumping complaint, maybe improperly handled animal remains. Like many small jobs in a city so vast, it appeared solvable with the right few phone calls. But as soon as officers descended into the basement, the sheer strangeness of the situation stopped them in their tracks. Under the naked fluorescent bulbs of the storage floors, piles of the gelatinous, fleshy mass lay stark, glinting faintly under the heat of the downlights. The sharp stench smothered the air, forcing the officers to stifle gagging into their sleeves. "This," one cop muttered to his partner, "is not normal." Other officers tried to maintain their professional composure, but the unease was impossible to shrug off. "We need the crime scene unit here, now!" barked the lead officer into her radio. Within an hour, the scene morphed from mildly chaotic to a tense hub of investigative activity. Crime scene investigators, CSIs, equipped with gloves, respirators, and evidence collection kits flooded the basement. The fleshy remains, now illuminated more closely, revealed strands of hair, fragments of what appeared to be bone or cartilage, and a slick layer of reddish-brown residue that clung to nearby surfaces. Samples were meticulously collected into sealed bags to be analyzed by forensic labs uptown. Meanwhile, Detective Mike Jacobs, a seasoned investigator with over 20 years of experience in homicide, a veteran accustomed to the darkest corners of human nature, was called in after a preliminary radio report raised red flags. As he crouched near one of the fleshy chunks to examine it more closely, Jacobs' usual stoic demeanor faltered. "This," he said to no one in particular, "sure as hell isn't an animal." The building manager and superintendent were quickly pulled aside for questioning, but neither could provide anything of significance. They confirmed that no resident had reported anything unusual outside of the smell, and that there were no recent plumbing issues severe enough to explain such a grisly discovery. When pressed for information about the bile-filled vent system, the superintendent could only scratch his head. "We've had clogged pipes before, sure. Grease buildup mostly, 'cause it's an old system," he said before shifting uncomfortably. "But nothing like this. This is different." The investigators seemed to agree. Focus shifted rapidly to the building's tenants. A unified hypothesis emerged. The fleshy remains had likely entered the drainage system intentionally. Someone had deliberately disposed of whatever this was. As the team began combing through the tenant roster, an alarming pattern surfaced. 2 tenants on the top floor who had moved into a premium loft suite just months prior were listed under what appeared to be aliases. The names Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane rang no bells when cross-referenced, suggesting a potential layer of deception. Back across the city, forensic lab techs worked overtime to identify the remains. Under microscope and chemical analysis, their confirmation was chilling yet unsurprising. The fragments were undoubtedly human. Partial DNA profiles were extracted, but the forensic team wasn't holding their breath. Matching them to potential missing persons would be a time-consuming task, and Manhattan alone had hundreds of open cases from the past 5 years. Detective Jacobs returned to precinct headquarters to present the working theory to his superiors. "We have flesh," he said bluntly, slamming a photo of the basement find onto the table. When no one reacted, he added, "Human flesh, dumped into the drainage system of a 40-story building, disguised as a damn plumbing mishap. This wasn't an accident, it was a message." His captain raised an eyebrow. "A message? Jacobs, this looks more like someone panicked and tried hiding the evidence of something awful." "It's sloppy," Jacobs admitted, leaning forward. "But so are people who think they're invincible. Nobody just dumps this much without expecting questions." He jabbed a finger at the picture again. "So the question is, what the hell did they think no one would question?" Back at the building, interviews with the tenants proved just as unsettling. One young man in his 20s, a tech consultant who lived on the 3rd floor, mentioned hearing strange, wet, sloshing noises from the pipes late one evening a month ago. Another tenant, an elderly woman named Greta, recounted how she'd smelled something like death, long before anyone else took notice. "They thought I was nuts," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched a rosary. "But I know what rot smells like, detective. This wasn't garbage." The noise complaints, the stench, the late-night water use, all of it built an emerging narrative far more sinister than first imagined. As investigators pieced together these testimonies, alarms blared across digitized case files. Similar patterns had been reported in buildings where bodies, or at least parts of bodies, had been found discarded in waterways. This wasn't the first time New York City's sewers had harbored devastating secrets. The break in the case came when Detective Jacobs received a call from Special Agent Lisa McKenna of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. "I heard about your, do you call it, meat storm?" she said wryly. McKenna specialized in investigating serial criminals operating across state lines, and this peculiar case bore striking similarities to other incidents under active federal review. "We've tracked a similar MO in 2 unsolved cases, one in Chicago and another in Philadelphia. Same weird dumping method, both connected to clearly staged residences in high-income areas," McKenna explained. "You might have yourself not just a crime scene detective, but a pattern killer." Clues from the penthouse apartment. It didn't take long for investigators to zero in on the penthouse apartment of the building. The top-floor unit, far removed from the basement horrors, seemed an unlikely focal point at first, but as detectives began to piece together tenant records and interview residents, the penthouse quickly became a smoking gun wrapped in polished chrome and floor-to-ceiling windows. Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane had moved into the penthouse 6 months prior, under the guise of high-profile professionals. The pair claimed to work in finance and art, an odd combination but not impossible in a city like New York. They paid in cash, always a red flag for law enforcement, and kept largely to themselves, save for the occasional small talk with neighbors in the elevator or hallway. The penthouse itself was an oasis of excess. Gleaming hardwood floors, custom designer furniture, and abstract artwork adorned the walls. The level of luxury didn't match the laid-back demeanor of the tenants described by neighbors. "They didn't seem like they belonged," remarked one neighbor during questioning, a middle-aged woman with a conspicuous eye for detail. "They were polite but distant, never really invited anyone in either. And those walls? Too pristine. Most people leave scuff marks moving furniture, but not them." When Detective Mike Jacobs arrived at the penthouse with a search warrant, the first thing that struck him was the chilling sterility of the space. A single whiff of the air inside made him recoil. It smelled faintly of bleach, but with underlying hints of decay that no amount of cleaning could completely remove. "Jacobs," one CSI whispered while scanning the space with a flashlight, "this doesn't feel right. It's too clean." The initial search turned up little in the way of overt incriminating evidence. The kitchen was immaculate, the trash bin empty except for a freshly replaced liner. Bedrooms were pristine with unwrinkled bedsheets and untouched nightstands. Yet it was precisely this eerie clinical perfection that raised suspicions. People live in apartments, they don't curate them. It wasn't until a junior member of the forensic team began inspecting the bathroom that things started to come together. The tile grout along the edges of the bathtub appeared newer than the rest of the wall. A very subtle detail, but enough to set off alarms. With permission to do limited damage, the team cut into the grouting only to discover small dried flecks of something far more sinister beneath: blood. The grisly finds didn't end there. The drain in the shower yielded additional biological residues trapped deep within the pipes, suggesting something beyond normal use. Using specialized luminol sprays, investigators discovered faint, streaky patterns across the bathroom floor, indicators of bloodied substances being dragged or cleaned up hastily. The bathroom, despite its gleaming appearance, was unmistakably the scene of gruesome activity. "Why a penthouse?" Jacobs muttered, pacing back and forth as forensic techs combed the bathroom for samples. "If this is what it looks like, why not somewhere deserted? Why not a back alley or a shady apartment? Why go premium and then do—" He gestured to the stained shower drain. "That." The answer came in the form of the utility closet tucked next to the bathroom. There, behind an unassuming stack of detergent bottles, they found what would later be referred to as the kit. A neatly packed duffel bag containing duct tape, knives, zip ties, and an industrial meat grinder. The find silenced the room. "It's a murder kit," one of the younger officers whispered, his voice shaky. "No kidding, rookie," Jacobs shot back, though his tone betrayed his own unease. The neighbors, meanwhile, provided more context about the duo. Dwight had introduced himself briefly as a tax consultant, often dressed sharply in suits, while Daniel, the so-called artist, lived in hoodies and carried canvases obscured by plastic wrap in and out of the building. None of the neighbors remembered seeing any art ever installed in their unit, however, and no one could recall Dwight actually leaving for work on a daily basis. Then there was the noise. "We heard things late at night," the tenant directly below the penthouse admitted reluctantly. "We're talking pounding sounds, like furniture being dragged or dropped. A couple of nights it sounded like running water going on for hours. My wife joked they were probably butchering pigs or something for some art project. We didn't take it seriously." But the most damning piece of evidence came from the garbage chute system. A thorough examination revealed that waste from the penthouse matched remnants of the bloody residue found in the basement drainage system. The chutes connected to the building's garbage compactor had likely been used to transport soft tissue, a grim thought that made every investigator in the room fall silent. Armed with a new warrant, Detective Jacobs widened the scope of the search. This time they focused on hidden storage spaces, cracking open HVAC panels and dismantling wall sections. The attic incinerated any remaining doubt. Inside were small remnants of fabric scraps soaked in blood, strands of blonde hair that didn't match either of the tenants, and tiny bone shards lodged between wood planks. "This wasn't just an ordinary crime," Jacobs admitted later to the press. This was calculated. Our suspects planned this for months, maybe longer. The penthouse wasn't a home, it was a front for their operation." FBI Special Agent Lisa McKenna, who had previously theorized a connection to similar murders, arrived at the scene the following afternoon to review the files. "This changes everything," she remarked grimly. "They weren't just hiding in plain sight, they were thriving in it. High-rise luxury gave them cover. Nobody suspects evil dressed in designer suits." With mounting evidence and shocking revelations, the case against Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane unraveled quickly, though the question lingered. Where were they now? The penthouse was empty save for the incriminating remains they had left behind. And so the chase began, spiraling out of the gloss and glamour of Manhattan and into darker corners of the country. Shadows beneath the glittering facade of society. As investigators peeled back the layers of Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane's carefully curated lives, a far darker picture began to emerge. On the surface, they were two individuals basking in the privilege afforded by New York's elite culture. A sleek penthouse, designer wardrobes, and ambiguous yet seemingly lucrative professions that fit snugly into the city's fast-paced ethos. Yet beneath this polished exterior lurked a story of desperation, deception, and predatory intent that tied them to a string of unsolved crimes stretching far beyond Manhattan's iconic skyline. It began with a chilling revelation from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Special Agent Lisa McKenna, a leading profiler specializing in serial offenders, had uncovered disturbing parallels between this gruesome case and a handful of others scattered across major urban centers: Chicago, Philadelphia, Dallas. She brought photographic evidence, mangled remains retrieved from drainage systems, bloodied fragments found in high-rise trash compactors, and eerily similar patterns of tenant behavior preceding the crimes. All pointed to a systematic operation masked under the guise of affluence. "These guys," McKenna stated during a joint task force meeting, "didn't just stumble into this. They built an identity, a persona that gave them cover in plain sight. They weren't hiding from society, they were embedded in it." Jacobs, seated across the table, flipped through the disturbing dossier. "So they're escalating?" he asked. McKenna nodded grimly. "Absolutely. What's most chilling is the profile we're seeing. It's not just about money or power. It's psychological. They live off this city's energy while feeding on its vulnerability." This realization sent shockwaves through the task force, pushing detectives and FBI agents alike to reconsider what they thought they knew about Fisher and Crane. The two men weren't just killers operating in secrecy, they were predators whose chosen hunting ground was society's most opulent corners, preying on those lured by the same glitz and glamour they exploited to mask their crimes. The victims, stories hidden in the shadows. As more of the flesh fragments from the basement drainage system were tested for DNA, the alarming truth emerged. The remains didn't belong to just one person. Multiple profiles were identified, all linking back to young women who had disappeared over the last 4 years. These missing women, once faceless statistics in a city too large for individual tragedies to linger long, suddenly became the focus of the investigation. Most had been on the fringes of New York's entertainment and nightlife industries: bartenders, aspiring models, nightclub hosts, women with dreams too big for their wallets who'd come to the city chasing the promise of opportunity, only to vanish into its darkest corners. Their files revealed troubling similarities. Each victim had been reported missing days, sometimes weeks, after their last known sightings in high-end hotels, luxury apartments, or exclusive rooftop lounges. Investigators pored over licensing and surveillance footage, retracing steps that all seemed to converge within certain high-income districts. "I just thought she was taking the world by storm," said the mother of one victim, choking back tears during an interview with detectives. Her Instagram was all champagne glasses and skyline photos, and then, nothing, just silence. This heartbreaking pattern underscored the grim reality detectives were now piecing together. Fisher and Crane weren't merely opportunistic. They meticulously curated their appearances and behaviors to match the exact environments their victims aspired to belong to. In glittering penthouses and VIP booths, no one questioned flamboyant spending, million-dollar smiles, or cryptic stories about thriving careers. To their victims, they were polished men of success, willing to indulge their company and their dreams. Yet in truth, Fisher and Crane weren't socialites. They didn't belong in big-money circles. What little cash they flaunted leaked from the same criminal enterprise that now unraveled before law enforcement. The penthouse was rented with piles of laundered money from stolen identities. The designer suits were bought in bulk second-hand, or outright stolen, and their carefully constructed social media accounts, which suggested vibrant lives filled with art exhibitions and financial triumphs, were nothing more than blank canvases, showing just enough to provide legitimacy, but too vague to look truly credible. The predator's playground. With their eyes now trained on Fisher and Crane, investigators realized the scope of the playground these two predators had engineered. They roamed upscale cocktail bars, exclusive art galleries, and rooftop clubs, venues bristling with creative professionals and wide-eyed newcomers desperate for breaks, validation, or merely the thrill of fleeting luxury. The pair worked seamlessly together, with Dwight spinning tales of financial success while Daniel played the enigmatic artist. Their ability to blend into these environments was their most lethal weapon. They're like Manhattan vampires, feeding off the city's excesses while pretending to be part of its noble class, McKenna said during a profiling session. In one case, surveillance footage from a West Village nightclub showed Dwight striking up a conversation with a wide-eyed bartender. She leaned in, captivated by his charisma, before he bought her a drink and handed her a thick tip. The same bartender was reported missing 2 weeks later. Reconstructing her last known steps revealed Fisher and Crane had likely taken her up to their penthouse, where the trail abruptly ended. But why did they pick these victims? McKenna suggested that the pair may have been driven by a twisted mix of thrill, power, and addiction to control. These men chose their targets because they're transient, the dreamers this city attracts, she explained, and just as importantly, they knew no one would question them taking these women. In Fisher and Crane's world, money, charm, and the right suit made them untouchable. The cracks begin to show. Fisher and Crane's schemes were chillingly effective, but they weren't flawless. Bank records showed recurrent cash withdrawals made in neighborhoods adjacent to their victims' disappearances. An obvious attempt to avoid tracing, but one that now painted their financial trail for forensic accountants. Additionally, neighbors who long dismissed the oddities surrounding the penthouse began coming forward when pressed by detectives. "It's not just the smells I thought were weird," explained one neighbor. "There were moments I'd hear arguments. Lewis and 9A used to joke they were chopping up a body because of how loud things got. We didn't know." With every unraveling thread, the carefully curated mythology of Fisher and Crane began to erode. They were no longer untouchable predators skiing the glittering ice of New York's highest society. Their darkness, found embedded in the city's shadows, had begun seeping into the light. Now it wasn't just law enforcement who saw them for what they were. New York itself was beginning to recognize the monsters dancing in its spotlight. The identity of the predators. The investigation into the horrific trail of flesh, blood, and sinister intent led detectives to zero in on two names, Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane. However, as the probe continued, it became evident that these identities were only the tip of the iceberg. What started as the names on a penthouse lease spiraled into a labyrinth of false identities, untraceable financial accounts, and a chilling game of manipulation that had kept the predators hidden in plain sight for months, if not years. Reconstructing Dwight Fisher's shadowy past. Dwight Fisher was the epitome of a smooth-talking con man. Tall, confident, and perpetually dressed in expensive suits, he fit perfectly into the upscale environments he and his accomplice prowled. Unlike Daniel Crane, whose bohemian persona felt slightly out of place in high society circles, Fisher had mastered the art of blending in. But lying beneath the polished exterior was a darker story, one that unraveled under police scrutiny. Fisher had a criminal record stretching back over a decade, mostly involving fraud and identity theft. Born in Cleveland, Ohio, Dwight grew up in a broken home surrounded by poverty and illicit dealings. By the time he turned 18, Fisher was already honing the skills that would later become his tools of predation, charm, deceit, and the ruthless ability to manipulate others for personal gain. In his 20s, Fisher moved to Chicago, where he began running small-time cons, posing as a financial consultant. His scams grew more sophisticated over the years, targeting vulnerable professionals and middle-class families investing in fake portfolios. While he wasn't violent in those early crimes, his ability to exploit trust and present himself as a man of wealth hinted at the predator he would eventually become. "When we pulled his records," explained Detective Jacobs at a press briefing, "it was like flipping through chapters of a perfect storm. This guy wasn't just a scam artist, he was someone who, over time, began to find joy in control and deception. He wanted more than money, he wanted power." By the time Dwight Fisher met Daniel Crane, his transition from fraudster to something far darker was almost complete. Investigators theorized that it was Fisher who masterminded their plan, convincing Crane not only to help him, but to embrace the monstrous doubling of false identity and violence that allowed the two to evade accountability for so long. The enigmatic and disturbed Daniel Crane. If Dwight Fisher wore the face of sleek professionalism, Daniel Crane draped himself in tortured artistry. He was the wild card of the duo, with a personality that teetered between soft-spoken eccentricity and an unsettling volatility. A failed artist with no notable gallery exhibits or critical acclaim to his name, Crane nonetheless carried canvas rolls and art supplies as if he were on the cusp of his big break. His presence in the elite art world was entirely fabricated, another tool in the duo's manipulative arsenal used to disarm the suspicions of their potential victims. Crane's background was murkier than Fisher's, but piecing together fragments revealed a troubling tapestry. Born in a small Pennsylvania town, Crane's early life was marked by neglect, violence, and mental instability. Records showed he spent the better part of his teenage years in and out of juvenile detention for arson and petty theft. Crane's fascination with destruction became more apparent when investigators uncovered that he was once institutionalized for setting fire to a family home. A blaze started disturbingly for artistic inspiration. He was released in his mid-20s after psychiatrists deemed him no longer a threat to society. "You look at someone like Daniel Crane," Special Agent McKenna observed, "and you don't just see a man who lost his way in life. You see a man who spent years building an obsession with control, with creation and destruction. Art wasn't just his passion, it became his excuse." Crane met Fisher under mysterious circumstances in Philadelphia. It's unclear how the two men became partners, but investigators theorize they bonded over shared resentments and an unspoken understanding of their tendencies. Crane, the quiet accomplice, likely provided the creative masks for their deceptions, while Fisher played the more polished persona. Together, they were lethal, working in perfect, horrifying harmony, living a lie, the predator's double lives. What made Fisher and Crane so effective as predators was their ability to fully integrate into the very world they targeted. They adopted identities that made them look not just acceptable but successful, desirable even. Fisher's career as a financial consultant and Crane's pretense as an artist weren't just lies. They were entire narratives crafted to earn trust and disarm suspicion. Through false documents, several layers of anonymity, and what appeared to be years of practice in manipulation, the two managed to infiltrate New York's upper echelons of society. Living in a penthouse apartment gave them an air of legitimacy. Showing up at exclusive rooftop bars and art galleries turned them into fixtures of a lifestyle their victims aspired to. "They were chameleons," McKenna said, reviewing footage from one of the upscale clubs where Fisher and Crane frequently appeared. "They didn't just play the part, they became it. They made people believe they were exactly where they deserved to be. This air of legitimacy is what allowed them to operate undetected for as long as they did." Fisher's crafted charisma and Crane's mysterious persona made them appealing to a specific set of victims, young women seeking validation, adventure, and a taste of glamour. Deeper psychological shadows. One of the most unnerving aspects of the duo was their psychological compatibility. Most partnerships in crime unravel due to disagreements or mistrust, but Fisher and Crane operated as though they were two halves of the same machine. FBI profilers later theorized that Fisher's sociopathic tendencies, the cold need for control and manipulation, were perfectly complemented by Crane's emotional instability and artistic obsession with power through destruction. Investigators uncovered a chilling detail. Crane kept a hidden journal filled with dark sketches, cryptic notations, and what appeared to be poetic descriptions of their crimes. Bits of hair and fragments of fabric were tucked between its pages like trophies. To law enforcement, it wasn't just evidence, it was a glimpse into Crane's psyche, a twisted need to immortalize the pain they inflicted. "They didn't just kill for convenience," Jacobs said after reviewing the evidence. "They killed because they needed to. It was almost ritualistic. Fisher fed off control and Crane fed off emotion. Together they created their own kind of madness." The masks begin to crack. Despite their chilling effectiveness, Fisher and Crane were not infallible. The investigation revealed cracks in their carefully constructed identities. Financial records showed inconsistencies, including multiple withdrawals from untraceable accounts and lavish spending that raised red flags once scrutinized. Surveillance footage placed them in more locations connected to their victims than they likely realized, tying them directly to several missing persons cases. And then there was the human element, the neighbors, acquaintances, and people who had brushed shoulders with the duo in passing. As police and FBI detectives pushed harder, those who initially dismissed the duo's oddities as quirks began to piece things together. The pounding noises late at night, the faint yet unmistakable smell of bleach wafting from their penthouse door, the deliberate evasiveness when asked about their careers. It all began to form a damning picture of who Fisher and Crane really were. The perfect escape plan. When Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane abruptly vanished from their sleek Manhattan penthouse, it seemed as though they had dissolved into thin air. As investigators scoured the crime scene and combed through the mounting evidence, the duo had already set their carefully orchestrated escape plan into motion. This wasn't a panicked flight born of desperation. This was a polished machine of evasion honed by years of deceit and false identities. To the outside world, they were gone. To law enforcement, they had become ghosts. One step ahead. Dwight and Daniel were no amateurs when it came to disappearing. They had prepared for the possibility of being discovered long before they attracted the attention of New York City police. In fact, their entire existence seemed predicated on their ability to adapt, to vanish, and to keep moving. From the very beginning, Dwight had been meticulous in building layers of anonymity for both himself and Crane. Their apartment lease, for example, had been signed under fraudulent names created using forged documents. Bank accounts tied to those names cycled small sums of money in and out of shadowy offshore accounts, further obscuring their financial activities. Dwight, with his background in identity theft and fraud, had ensured that every paper trail they left behind was either false or irrelevant. To anyone chasing them, it looked like a string of dead ends pieced together by someone who didn't intend to stay in one place for long. "They weren't just ready to run," noted Detective Jacobs while piecing together their movements. "They built their entire lives for this moment. Would-be ghosts playing house until the heat got too close." The first clue to their escape emerged when the forensic team analyzed their use of burner phones, cheap, disposable cell phones purchased in cash at chain stores across the city. One such phone, discarded in a subway trash can miles from the crime scene, provided a brief snapshot of their movements immediately after leaving the penthouse. A single call had been placed to a number traced back to a Wyoming area code. "What's out in Wyoming?" Jacobs asked aloud during a briefing. "Mountains, silence, or maybe another damn false lead?" A trail of disguises. Regardless of where they were going, Fisher and Crane had the tools to get there unnoticed. Witnesses from train stations and bus depots claimed to have seen two men vaguely matching the suspects' descriptions, though each account was frustratingly inconsistent. One described Dwight Fisher as a man in work boots and a baseball cap, blending into the crowd like a construction worker. Another claimed he was dressed sharply, wearing sunglasses and carrying a leather briefcase. Daniel Crane, similarly elusive, had been spotted in oversized hoodies and jeans, his usually unruly hair hidden beneath various beanies and caps. "They could be anyone," Jacobs muttered, while staring at a board littered with grainy surveillance photos. "And that's the problem. Their whole act is about being whoever they need to be to slip through the cracks." Their skills in misdirection grew even more apparent when an abandoned rental car was found outside a truck stop in Pennsylvania. Inside, investigators found receipts from local diners and gas stations, dated just 24 hours earlier. It seemed the duo had briefly stopped before switching to another vehicle, or perhaps another method of transportation, entirely. False leads, real panic. By the time their trail reached the Midwest, Fisher and Crane's ability to leave misleading breadcrumbs began to wear on investigators. A surveillance camera near a rest area off I-70 showed two men matching their descriptions purchasing water bottles and snacks, but as FBI agents descended on the scene, no further leads emerged. They had seemingly left no other evidence behind. "They're playing chess while we're stuck on checkers," Special Agent McKenna sighed as she reviewed the footage. Fisher and Crane's every move seemed calculated to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. At one point, a financial record tied to a false identity previously used by Fisher raised alarms in St. Louis, Missouri. Authorities rushed to stake out an address linked to a small Airbnb property on the city's outskirts. While the team descended on the location, they were greeted by nothing more than empty beer cans and rumpled sheets on the Airbnb's beds. Fisher and Crane had apparently been there, briefly, but were gone long before anyone thought to look. The duo's ability to stay mobile was amplified by their reliance on cash-based transactions. Hotel check-ins were made under fake names, sometimes just hours before checking out again. Gas stations didn't require identification, and local bus tickets rarely left much of a paper trail. Each time they appeared to surface, they evaporated immediately after, leaving only traces of their presence behind, chasing shadows across state lines. As the days turned into weeks, Fisher and Crane's escape began to resemble something out of a Hollywood thriller. Despite the FBI's involvement and the gradual expansion of their investigation across state lines, the duo continued to evade capture. A farmer in Kansas reported seeing two unfamiliar men camping discreetly on his property, but local authorities arrived to find nothing but a smoldering campfire. "They knew how to disappear into the noise," McKenna commented, frustration seeping into her otherwise controlled demeanor. "America's vast open spaces are a perfect hiding ground for anyone serially desperate enough to use them." A brief breakthrough came when investigators managed to trace a pickup truck purchased in cash at a used car lot in Arkansas. The lot owner described two men fitting Fisher and Crane's descriptions, with Dwight posing as a friendly traveler looking to transport construction supplies. He even pulled out a fake business card saying he ran a remodeling company back in Houston. The truck, however, was found near a burned-out barn just a few hundred miles from where it had been purchased. Fisher and Crane had again abandoned their transportation, leaving behind only ashes and tire marks, leading nowhere. The illusion of control. In the eyes of law enforcement, Fisher and Crane's disappearance was no longer just a manhunt, it was a psychological war. The predators were proving that not only could they vanish, but they could control the narrative, dictating the pace and direction of the investigation. From Texas to Tennessee, sightings and leads sprang up like wildfire, but each new report only added to the fog surrounding their movements. It became increasingly clear that while they may have been running, Fisher and Crane weren't acting recklessly. Everything about their escape suggested planning, purpose, and above all, patience. FBI experts theorized that their goal wasn't just to avoid capture, it was to stall, to wear down the resolve of the authorities chasing them. "These guys don't need to stop," Jacobs acknowledged during a tense strategy meeting. "They're predators living in a world that rewards chameleons. As long as they're willing to adapt, we might never find them." The grip tightens. Behind the scenes, however, the net was slowly tightening. Forensic experts continued to pore over every scrap of evidence from their Manhattan hideout, piecing together digital breadcrumbs and bank records that hinted at a possible future destination. A routine medical checkup in Houston by Dwight's estranged younger brother finally broke the case open, leading investigators to narrow their sights on the Midwest, specifically rural areas near Kansas City. It was here, deep in the heart of America's lesser-trod paths, that Fisher and Crane's carefully orchestrated escape plan would face its greatest challenge: a trail from family ties. For all the meticulous planning that Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane had poured into their escape, the thread that began to unravel their intricate evasion was one they could neither foresee nor control: family. While the duo operated as lone wolves in their predatory exploits, distanced from any meaningful personal connections, one thing they couldn't fully sever were the echoes of their pre-criminal lives. And it was these echoes, faint yet persistent, that would give investigators the first real breakthrough in the tense manhunt. Dwight's estranged brother Dwight Fisher had worked tirelessly to erase the identity he was born with, adopting layers of fraud and deception that secured him anonymity, but no amount of false paperwork and offshore accounts could entirely cover his tracks. While Dwight himself refused any ties to his impoverished Cleveland upbringing, his younger brother Anthony Fisher had taken a different path. Unlike Dwight, Anthony had stayed in Ohio, leading a simple, lawful life as a mechanic in a modest Houston suburb. Anthony and Dwight hadn't spoken in years. By the time the investigation began cascading toward its fever pitch, law enforcement's exhaustive analysis of Dwight's history revealed Anthony's existence. At first he seemed like an irrelevant footnote, a sibling disconnected from the urban chaos Dwight and Daniel thrived in, but authorities knew from experience that family ties, even strained ones, often leave a paper trail that could produce valuable breadcrumbs. "We didn't think much of him at first," admitted Special Agent Lisa McKenna in a post-case briefing, "but what tipped us off was the timing. It was the odd coincidence of his sudden medical checkup." As Fisher and Crane fled Manhattan, Anthony Fisher made a seemingly routine visit to his local clinic in Houston for chest pains. On the surface, it had nothing to do with the fugitive investigation. But while reviewing unusual withdrawals from Dwight's tangled financial web, the team discovered frequent cash payments toward a medical debt originating from the same Houston clinic Anthony visited. What really nailed it wasn't even the payments themselves, Detective Jacobs explained later. It was the fact that Dwight was dumb enough, or desperate enough, to send those payments directly into the clinic's processing system. No offshore shell accounts, no anonymity, one tiny oversight. That's all it took. The subtle lead grows stronger. Though Fisher and Crane had vanished into the sprawl of America's Midwest, an increasing amount of circumstantial evidence tied Dwight to Anthony's Houston clinic payments. When approached by local authorities, Anthony expressed shock at the idea of his brother resurfacing after so many years, but his ambiguous demeanor triggered suspicion in the investigators. He wasn't lying, not exactly, McKenna recalled, but you could tell he was scared. Maybe he hadn't seen Dwight, maybe he had, but what we did notice was a layer of evasiveness, answers that were careful but not entirely untrue. It was when federal authorities expanded surveillance around Anthony's residence that they found the first tangible cracks in Dwight Fisher's escape plan. Trail cameras planted discreetly near dumpster zones and convenience stores frequented by Anthony captured images of a man who, though heavily disguised, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Dwight. Working nonstop, the investigators reviewed hotel and motel registries across Houston. A blurry surveillance video from a motel off I-10 provided the breakthrough. Dwight Fisher, spotted without Daniel Crane, had rented a cheap room for one night. But by the time police arrived, both the room and its occupant were empty, except for a single, crumpled soda can left on the nightstand. The DNA slip-up authorities sent the soda can for expedited DNA analysis, and though the results took time, the findings were damning. The sample extracted matched the DNA profiles pulled from the horror scene at the Manhattan apartment building's drainage systems. There was no longer any doubt. Dwight Fisher had stopped in Houston. Moreover, Anthony's neighbor, pressed by FBI agents, reluctantly admitted to seeing what looked like an unfamiliar truck with out-of-state plates parked in Anthony's driveway late one evening, drivers shifting uncomfortably in their seats as if debating whether to linger or leave. The description matched a pickup confirmed as purchased in cash in Arkansas just days before the sighting. Family's unintentional betrayal. "I didn't know he was dangerous," Anthony Fisher later confessed in an interview. "I swear I didn't. He just kept saying he needed help, that someone was after him, but I didn't know it was the damn FBI." Though Anthony hadn't directly abetted Dwight's crimes, his reluctant hospitality, letting his brother stay for one night, had opened a small yet significant crack in the duo's defenses. During Dwight's brief stop at Anthony's home, surveillance cameras from Highway Patrol recorded their truck heading west the following morning, with Daniel Crane seemingly rejoining the fugitive. The direction narrowed their route into the heart of the Midwest. Clues from the meeting. The recorded behavior of both suspects suggested tension within the partnership as the net around them tightened. One witness, who unknowingly served Dwight and Daniel at a gas station cafe near Kansas, recalled muted arguments between the two fugitives. "They didn't act like friends," she told law enforcement, "more like business partners who were real sick of each other. One of them, Crane, I think, he just looked at the other guy like he wanted to deck him." This testimony matched behavioral patterns FBI profilers had warned of. Escaping law enforcement is harder on criminals than most people think, McKenna explained. Partners like Dwight and Daniel start thriving on control. They need to feel invincible, to feel like they're playing the world like a game. But as stress builds, loyalty shatters, and paranoia sets in. The strain surfacing between Dwight and Crane became a vital point of focus for law enforcement. While their conflict accelerated their attempts at evasion, it also bred carelessness. The once organized predators began cutting corners. A toll road camera in Missouri captured Daniel Crane leaning out of the truck window, smoking, a rare behavioral lapse suggesting they'd stopped caring as much about anonymity. Family ties that unraveled it all. In the end, the ties of blood, fragile and frayed, exposed Fisher in ways he had avoided for years. Family may have been a weakness he tried to sever, but in his desperation, even a fleeting connection like his estranged brother provided law enforcement with the pivot point they needed. Once Dwight set foot in Houston, any hope of the duo disappearing completely was lost. "We've seen it time and time again," Jacobs remarked during a press briefing. "They think they've planned for everything, that the past is something they can just bury. But they always miscalculate how the smallest human connection will trip them up. Family doesn't just go away, no matter how badly you want it to." FBI launches massive operation. When the manhunt for Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane escalated beyond city and state boundaries, it became clear that the investigation required a national-level response. No longer just a case of local or state jurisdiction, this duo had proven themselves skilled enough to navigate through the cracks of law enforcement systems across the country. It was time for the FBI to fully engage, sparing no resources in their pursuit of two of the most dangerous fugitives in modern memory: activation of federal authority. As the evidence began to mount and the trail of the two men continued to snake through multiple states, the FBI officially declared Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane fugitives of the United States government. The Department of Justice authorized a nationwide arrest warrant, classifying them as armed and extremely dangerous predators. Violent crimes and major offenders, VCMO units within the FBI took the lead, but the case quickly became a multi-agency effort involving not only the FBI but also U.S. Marshals, state police, and even specialized military support divisions for technical operations. Special Agent Lisa McKenna, who had been tracking Fisher and Crane since their first slip from the Manhattan penthouse, was appointed as the operational lead. "We weren't just chasing killers," she said in a press conference after the operation began. "We were chasing predators who had perfected the art of manipulation and invisibility that makes them infinitely more dangerous." With McKenna's leadership, the FBI set up a central command center in Kansas City, a strategic choice given the suspects' last known movements. The center was equipped with cutting-edge surveillance technology, forensic laboratories to process real-time evidence, and numerous analysts monitoring the movement of the fugitives. Maps of highways, rural byways, and potential hideouts sprawled across whiteboards and digital screens, showing the duo's possible escape routes while strategists updated every new lead. Technology as the front line. One of the most powerful tools in the operation was the FBI's advanced technology. Facial recognition software was deployed across surveillance cameras in bus stops, airports, gas stations, and motels nationwide. Any person matching Fisher or Crane's descriptions would trigger instant alerts to the command center. The team's cyber unit dove headfirst into Fisher's financial accounts, scouring for any anomalies tied to hotels, transportation, or even convenience store purchases. "We used every digital breadcrumb we could find," McKenna explained. "They were clever, but no one leaves absolutely no trail. There's always something. A wrongly discarded receipt, a shadow on surveillance footage, a ping from a burner phone in the wrong place. Our job was to find that one thing." In one such instance, the suspects made the mistake of using free Wi-Fi at an all-night diner in Topeka, Kansas. Though they connected through a smartphone registered under a fake name, cyber analysts were able to trace the device's unique MAC address, adding another mark to their probable location. This moment reinforced the importance of marrying human intelligence with technology. Alongside digital searches, drones equipped with infrared detectability and high-powered zoom cameras were deployed in rural areas where eyewitness accounts placed the fugitives hiking or camping. Helicopter sweeps over wilderness preserves ensured terrain that couldn't be reached by law enforcement vehicles was thoroughly examined. A nationwide partnership. No single agency could handle a case this expansive. The FBI coordinated with local police departments in every potential state the fugitives could cross into. Over 30 jurisdictions were brought into the fold, each receiving constant updates fed through the central command. Local officers were trained to act as the FBI's eyes on the ground, patrolling rural areas, monitoring suspicious vehicles, and even speaking with shop owners and gas station attendants about the duo. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marshals Service, renowned for their expertise in high-profile fugitive apprehensions, provided an additional layer of boots-on-the-ground investigators. Their fugitive task force joined the chase, particularly focused on tracking Fisher and Crane's movements through financial traces and known rental vehicle patterns. "We operated like a well-oiled machine," said McKenna during a debrief post-capture. "Everyone, from local sheriffs patrolling back roads to technicians crunching numbers at FBI headquarters, played a critical role in stopping these monsters before they could hurt anyone else." To bolster public awareness, the FBI launched an extensive media campaign. Fisher and Crane's photos, along with rewards totaling $250,000 for tips leading to their arrest, were broadcast on every major network. Billboards along highways read, "Wanted, Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane, armed and dangerous," in bold, captivating letters. Social media became another avenue for capturing leads. Anonymous tip lines flooded with calls as amateur sleuths and concerned citizens across the country speculated about sightings. Covert surveillance, the shadow game. The Bureau also opted to play a quieter game of cat and mouse when necessary. Special undercover teams moved into areas where Fisher and Crane had been spotted, often pretending to be tourists, truck drivers, or even homeless individuals to blend into potential hiding spots. Law enforcement posed as customers at diners, clerks in convenience stores, and weekend hunters in towns bordering Montana and Wyoming. Portable listening devices disguised as everyday objects, drink cans sitting on counters, radios, and trucks, were used to pick up idle chatter in these ghost towns. Tips that may have seemed inconsequential, such as a truck stop cashier recalling a man matching Crane's description buying cigarettes, were folded into the growing web of possibilities drawn around their routes of escape. Psychological profiling to predict their next move. A significant part of the campaign to capture Fisher and Crane revolved around the psychological profiles built for each man. McKenna, along with FBI behavioral analysts, poured through years of their documented crimes, habits, and even patterns in interviews or letters written by Crane during his brief institutionalization. It became clear early on that Fisher thrived on control, while Crane's volatility and emotional impulsiveness often ruptured their otherwise meticulous operations. This dynamic of theirs was both their greatest strength and their Achilles heel, McKenna explained. Fisher was a planner, a leader. But Crane was the ticking time bomb. The longer they ran, the more likely their dynamic would fracture. Investigators tracked this psychological weakness to anticipate where they might go next. Smaller rural towns, places where Fisher could assert planning while Crane was allowed to rest and cool off, became top priorities for surveillance. "We knew Fisher wouldn't risk Crane blowing up in a city," McKenna added. "He knew the only way they could survive was isolation. Pressure mounts." As the operation entered its final stages, the net around Fisher and Crane began to tighten. Pressure increased as more leads came in from the public, and as surveillance continued narrowing their trajectory. Special Agent McKenna announced Phase 2 of the operation just 2 weeks into the nationwide manhunt, a series of state-by-state roadblocks and coordinated no-fly zones intended to funnel the suspects toward fewer options of escape. The duo's glimmering facade of invincibility, perfected over years of deceit, was now under siege. Every gas station, every campsite, every abandoned barn they touched became an eventual breadcrumb leading right back to the command center in Kansas City. A timeless warning. The FBI's operation was heralded as one of the most technologically and logistically advanced manhunts in recent decades. Beyond capturing 2 killers, it served as a reminder, no matter how clever, no matter how many identities are created, and no matter how well someone believes they've erased themselves from the map, true justice moves faster and reaches farther. The raid on the outskirts of Kansas City. It didn't matter how clever, careful, or calculated Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane had been throughout their bloody spree and elusive escape, every line they crossed, every frayed nerve, was slowly leading them to a climactic endgame. For weeks they had darted through America's heartland, playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with the authorities, but no one outruns the net forever. When a series of crucial tips funneled law enforcement's focus onto a remote property on the outskirts of Kansas City, the duo's labyrinth of evasions finally began to collapse beneath the unrelenting pressure of the FBI's massive operation. What happened next was the kind of raid few investigators ever forget, an electrifying hour-by-hour collision between justice and desperation that unfolded like a battle scene ripped right out of a Hollywood thriller. Gathering the intel, the breakthrough came from an anonymous tip. A farmer who lived near a decaying property on the city's outskirts noticed strange activity. A pickup truck parked behind the barn, unusual sounds in the middle of the night, and two unfamiliar men occasionally visible in the distance. At first, it seemed like a routine observation, easily dismissible. But when the FBI cross-referenced this report with intelligence from highway cameras, thermal drone sweeps, and local gas station purchases, all roads pointed back to this isolated property. "Everything about their movements screamed caution," said Special Agent Lisa McKenna, who spearheaded the operation. "Except this, they stayed in one place too long, that's where they screwed up." Before long, an FBI task force gathered at an undisclosed location just miles from the hideout. McKenna, Detective Jacobs, and a team of tactical experts strategized for hours, analyzing aerial surveillance and blueprints of the ramshackle property. The house was no luxurious penthouse this time. It was nothing more than a dilapidated farmhouse surrounded by overgrown grass and sprawling woods, a stark contrast to the gleaming lifestyle Fisher and Crane once pretended to fit into. "Ironic, isn't it?" Jacobs muttered, shaking his head as he studied the images sent back from drones scouting the perimeter. They went from designer suits and VIP lounges to squatting in what looks like a set from a horror film. "Desperation destroys ego," McKenna replied, staring intently at the screen. "They know this could be the end." A tactical plan. The Kansas City property presented challenges for law enforcement. Its remote location meant no backup would arrive quickly if things went south. The barn, with its creaking wooden exterior and rusted roof, was dotted with potential sniper hiding spots. Armed with the knowledge that Fisher and Crane were officially classified as armed and extremely dangerous, the FBI team incorporated every tool in their arsenal for a careful, calculated strike against the pair. By early morning, the operation was in motion. A convoy of unmarked SUVs carrying tactical agents, including FBI SWAT, local law enforcement, and U.S. Marshals, quietly rolled toward the hideout. All vehicles maintained calm silence, save for the soft hum of banter between agents preparing for the fight ahead. "Set expectations," McKenna briefed her team one final time. "Fisher is the chess player. He's the manipulator. If he surrenders, he'll try to negotiate, buy time, anything to keep his grip on control. Crane, he's your wild card. Unstable. Volatile. If we corner him, he's going to explode and it won't be clean. Stay sharp." Agents spread out miles before reaching the property's perimeter, securing exits. Air support hovered just out of earshot, standing ready to deploy thermal imaging and suppressive tactics if the situation escalated. The moment of truth. As the first light of dawn broke over the Kansas City skyline, the raid began. Tactical agents silently advanced in their positions. They stayed low, weaving through tall weeds and broken-down fences. The whisper of radios barely audible. A team stationed themselves near the back door, while another kept watch on the barn, where faint movements were visible through a partially open window. Inside the house, Fisher and Crane were already on edge. Drone footage captured fleeting glimpses of them the night before, arguing, pacing, and seemingly packing. It appeared they were debating whether to flee once more or to bunker down and face whatever came next. "They're coming! Aren't they? I know they're coming!" Daniel Crane's frantic voice echoed through the crumbling walls. He clutched a kitchen knife and an old hunting rifle like a man desperate for control, but with no clear plan. "Shut up!" Fisher hissed, glancing through the worn curtains. "They don't know we're here. They're just guessing. Stick to the plan." But the plan was crumbling, and Fisher knew it. The Blitz SWAT agents issued the first warning over their speaker system. "Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane, this is the FBI. Come out with your hands in the air. You are surrounded." Inside the house, chaos erupted. "They found us! They found us!" Crane screamed. "I told you this wouldn't work!" He paced the small hall, his rifle aimed wildly in no particular direction. "Get control of yourself!" Fisher spat, attempting to wrestle the weapon from his partner's hands. The two men who had once shared a chilling, symbiotic relationship were now unraveling at the seams. Outside, agents moved like shadows, breaching the perimeter of both the house and barn simultaneously. Flashbangs pierced the silence, followed by a thundering crack as a SWAT team broke through the door. Fisher, always the planner, tried one final gambit: surrender. "Wait, wait!" he shouted from the center of the room, throwing his hands up as agents stormed in. "Let's talk about this! I can help you! I know things, valuable things!" Crane, however, was far from surrendering. With a guttural scream, he opened fire, forcing agents to scatter for cover. Bullets ripped through ancient drywall as heavy boots pounded against the creaking floorboards. "Drop your weapon now!" an agent shouted, his voice firm, unyielding. But if Crane heard the command, he didn't care. He fired recklessly, adrenaline and rage making him blind to the noose tightening around his neck. Finally, a well-placed tactical shot disarmed him, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. Crane collapsed in a heap, subdued but still thrashing. Fisher, meanwhile, stayed frozen, hands still raised, a cowardly smile plastered on his face. "I told you," he said coolly as agents cuffed him. "I'm the smart one." Victory, at last. Within minutes, the raid was over. Both fugitives were secured, and the property was swept for evidence. The barn revealed scraps of burned documents, likely an attempt to destroy lingering traces of their identity trail. Tools stained with unidentified substances were found in the basement, along with several eerie artifacts linked to their crimes, items that would later be paraded in court as reminders of their gruesome history. Back at the command center, cheers broke out as word spread that Fisher and Crane had finally been captured. For McKenna and her team, it wasn't just a victory, it was the culmination of weeks of unrelenting pressure. "They thought they could outthink us," Jacob said, shaking his head. "They thought they'd just keep running forever like they were invincible." "Well," McKenna added with a small smile, "they thought wrong." The aftermath. The raid on the outskirts of Kansas City marked the end of one of the most significant manhunts in recent FBI history. Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane, who had terrorized cities and evaded justice in a way few others ever could, were finally in custody. Hours after their arrest, photos of the raid and their disheveled, defeated faces were plastered across news networks nationwide. Headlines read, "The manhunt is over, Fisher and Crane captured in Kansas City." For Fisher, the chessboard had been flipped. For Crane, the nightmare he had spiraled into was finally over, delivering both men to a hard reckoning for the sins they'd committed. A tense confrontation. For weeks, Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane had been running, manipulating the shadows to their advantage. But when the final stand came, miles outside Kansas City in an atmosphere thick with desperation, escape was no longer an option. The FBI's calculated plan had flushed them out, leaving the sinister duo with their backs against the wall. No longer able to rely on deception or misdirection, Fisher and Crane faced their most brutal challenge yet, a direct confrontation with the relentless forces of justice. The scene wasn't one of Hollywood glamour, it wasn't dramatic rain or sweeping skylines. It was the humbling desolation of a rotting farmhouse surrounded by overgrown weeds, abandoned in its decay. But within that isolated stronghold, the situation was anything but lifeless. The air itself seemed charged with tension, a rising storm waiting to break. The intensity builds hours before dawn. The FBI and local authorities had surrounded the farmhouse with precision. Coordinated teams closed in from multiple angles, ensuring an escape route was impossible. Agents stationed themselves at strategic points around the property. A mix of tactical squads with the U.S. Marshals, FBI SWAT, and local police ready to execute the takedown. Inside the house, Fisher and Crane were on edge. After days of paranoia and second-guessing their every movement, it was as though the walls around them were closing in. Crane sat on a battered old couch, trembling, his fingers clutching a hunting rifle that seemed too big for him to control. By his side, Fisher remained calm, or at least seemed to be. His fingers fidgeted with a pen in his pocket, his sharp mind racing through contingencies. "We wait," Fisher said with an icy calm, peering through a slit in the tattered curtains. "They don't know we're here. We only move if when. There's no other option." "We've already lost!" Crane shot back, his voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "They'll storm in here any second. I told you we shouldn't have stopped here. You didn't listen." "Shut up!" Fisher snapped, his tone venomous. "Focus, Daniel. Focus. We get out of this the same way we've gotten out of everything so far, with control. You start losing it now, and it's over. For both of us." Crane gritted his teeth but remained silent, his breathing still erratic. Even as tension fractured their partnership, Fisher's attempts to maintain control proved a dwindling effort. Crane wasn't the same man he had been months ago, not after weeks of fraught escape and mounting pressure. The FBI delivers the first strike outside, the tension among law enforcement officers was equally high. They had seen Fisher and Crane's ability to evade at every turn, and none of them underestimated the potential volatility in facing them head-on. Every agent knew that this could be the moment where a split-second decision determined life or death, not just for themselves but for the innocent lives scarred by Fisher and Crane's actions. With sunrise peaking just above the treetops, the tactical team initiated the raid. Over the speaker system, a sharp, commanding voice rang out into the stillness of dawn. "This is the FBI! Dwight Fisher, Daniel Crane, you are completely surrounded! There is no escape! Come out with your hands up!" Inside the farmhouse, the announcement struck like a thunderclap. Crane jolted, his hands tightening around the rifle. "They found us! Oh God, they found us!" he babbled, pacing between the walls. Every step he took sent tremors through the creaking floorboards. "Daniel, stop!" Fisher barked, his icy demeanor finally cracking to reveal a creeping edge of panic. He rubbed his temples, his carefully constructed stoicism crumbling one meticulous piece at a time. "We're not done yet. Stick to the plan." "I'm done taking orders from you," Crane shot back, his wild eyes ablaze with adrenaline. The balance between them, which had always precariously tipped in Fisher's favor, had just shattered. The chaos unfolds. Outside, SWAT agents advanced with startling precision, their movements disciplined and steady. Breaking from cover, several teams approached the house's entrances. Agents carrying breaching tools and ballistic shields prepared to invade the structure, while Overwatch teams kept sniper rifles trained on possible exits. Inside, the cracks in Fisher and Crane's partnership reached a frenzy. Crane moved erratically through the small home, windows slamming shut as he tried to fortify the space. Every sound, from the crunch of boots in the distance to the rustle of wind through the trees, ignited his paranoia and sent the barrel of his rifle jittering in search of an unseen enemy. "It's over, Dwight!" Crane shouted. "We can't run anymore! I knew it was over the second you brought us here!" "Shut up, Crane!" Fisher leapt to his feet, his voice rising with uncommon anger. "You're going to get us both killed! Just stay in control, damn it!" But neither man had control any longer. Not over the situation, not over each other. The standoff reached its zenith when SWAT initiated the breach. Glass shattered, doors burst open, and flashbang grenades erupted in blinding light and deafening roars. The house filled with the sharp, directed shouts of specialized officers calling commands. "Drop your weapon! This is your last warning!" But Daniel Crane took no heed. His panic consumed him entirely. Lunging towards an overturned piece of furniture, he unleashed a tortured scream before firing wildly into the air. Bullets tore through drywall and splintered wooden beams but failed to hit their mark. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" the team leader yelled as agents ducked for cover. But Crane had no intention of giving in. Cornered animals don't surrender, they lash out. A line crossed. As Crane continued his reckless barrage, Fisher made his move. Raising his hands high into the air, he strode deliberately toward the sound of advancing footsteps. His face, eerily calm once more, betrayed no emotion. "Wait, wait," Fisher said loudly, his voice slicing through the commotion with its unnerving clarity. "Don't shoot! I surrender! I'm unarmed!" The agents in the room froze, their training curbing the tension of the moment just enough to pause. Even as Crane raged behind him, Fisher seemed to wear the cunning smile of a man who believed he still held the upper hand. "You won't kill me," Fisher said with unsettling confidence. "I've got everything you want. Information, answers." His gaze flickered briefly toward Crane, still spiraling into chaos, and he let out a slight chuckle. He, on the other hand... But before Fisher could finish, Crane turned on his partner with an expression of betrayal and rage. "You sold me out!" Crane screamed. "You think you're walking out of here? You don't care if I die!" Fisher's eyes barely widened before Crane raised the rifle again, this time aiming with deadly intent. He opened fire, forcing both agents and Fisher to dive for cover. What followed was a cascade of gunfire and shouted commands, the chaos reverberating through the flimsy walls of the decrepit house. The final act. The confrontation ended with precision and force. A single sniper shot rang out from outside the structure, striking the rifle from Crane's hands and sending him stumbling to the floor. SWAT agents stormed the room in a synchronized assault, overwhelming Crane before he had a chance to recover. Fisher watched, still huddled against the wall, as officers expertly immobilized his volatile partner. And though his gambit to manipulate and deflect his way out had failed, Fisher couldn't suppress a slight smirk as the agents finally turned their focus toward him. "I told you," Fisher muttered as he was forced to the ground and cuffed. "I'm the smart one." For once, no one laughed. Aftermath of the showdown outside the farmhouse, the sun's rays broke fully over the horizon as the dust settled. Fisher and Crane, two men who had spent their lives manipulating, preying, and running, were finally secured in the back of armored vehicles. Their partnership, like their escape, had ended in ruin. Agents exhaled deeply, some patting each other on the back, as the realization began to sink in. The fight was over. "This wasn't just a takedown," McKenna said quietly to Jacobs as she surveyed the scene. "It was an unraveling. They weren't facing us in the end. They were facing themselves." Jacobs nodded, his expression taut but relieved. "And look where it got them." unveiling the horrific truth. When the dust settled from the capture of Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane, the investigation transitioned from a manhunt to a cold, clinical examination of the horrors the duo had left in their wake. The unraveling of their crimes wasn't quick. It was like pulling at threads from a frayed tapestry, each tug revealing something more disturbing than the last. What began as speculation about their involvement in the grisly drainage discoveries in Manhattan unraveled into a nationwide account of methodical slaughter, manipulation, and exploitation that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The interrogation, broken masks. Inside the interrogation rooms, Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane answered questions in their own contrasting ways. Fisher, ever the manipulator, fell back on his usual tactics: arrogance, bargaining, and a calculated attempt to control the narrative. "You want the truth? Fine. I've got it," Fisher said with a sly smile as he leaned back in his chair, shackled but appearing unbothered. "But first I want guarantees. You don't screw this up for me, and I won't screw this up for you. Quid pro quo, officer." Detective Jacobs, having dealt with liars, killers, and narcissists throughout his career, didn't flinch. "You want to talk? Then talk. We've already got enough evidence to bury you 100 times over. This is your chance to make it sting less." Across the hall, Crane was an entirely different story. His manic energy had faded, leaving behind a shell of a man who either didn't understand, or refused to process, the gravity of what he had done. He refused to meet anyone's eyes as his shaking hands twisted in the cuffs in front of him. "I didn't want it to go this way," he muttered, half to himself, his voice trembling. I just wanted something that mattered. Dwight, he said it would matter. He said it wouldn't be like the others. We were doing something bigger than us. Art, he called it. Don't you get that? Interrogators leaned into Crane's unstable psyche, harnessing his desperation for validation. Slowly, piece by piece, and often with unintentional confessions, they began to piece together the chilling scope of their crimes. Horrific revelations, Manhattan's gruesome secrets. The first and perhaps most shocking confirmation was Fisher and Crane's admission to what they had done beneath the sleek Manhattan apartment building. Investigators had suspected it, but hearing Fisher candidly discuss the butchering of over 10 victims sent visible waves of unease through the room. "It was simple, really," Fisher said during questioning, as if recounting a mundane business deal. "You find someone who's got nothing left to lose, or rather, someone who doesn't know they'll lose it all until you take it from them. Then," he snapped his fingers, "everything else falls into place. A conversation here, an invitation there, and poof, they're gone." When asked why they used the building's drainage system to dispose of remains, Fisher smirked. "What can I say? I have an appreciation for irony. A high-rise in the heart of New York City, people sipping champagne in penthouses above while below. Let's just say the system worked for us." The remains discovered in the drainage system were eventually linked to victims spanning months, and in some cases, years. DNA testing confirmed Fisher and Crane had lured their victims with promises of glamour, status, or connection. Many were aspiring models, nightlife workers, or young professionals chasing dreams in the big city. They were transient, Fisher explained, easy targets, people whose friends chalk up their disappearance to starting fresh or moving on. Frankly, that's on them, not us. Crane's distorted vision of art. While Fisher painted himself as the mastermind, the true horror emerged from Crane's warped vision of what their crimes represented. His fragile mental state coupled with years of neglect and failure created a dangerous need to create something eternal, as he described it. I didn't think it was murder," Crane stammered. "Not really. Dwight said it was bigger than that, like a canvas. I was just another brushstroke, don't you see it? The blood, the destruction. It wasn't just random, it meant something." When pressed further, Crane's ramblings led investigators to the notebooks recovered during the raid in Kansas City. They were filled with haunting sketches, distorted human forms, poetic mutterings about life and death, and what appeared to be archive-like notes cataloging their victims. Elaine, 24, bartending at Midnight Lounge, pretty smile, wants to model, hide sadness well. The notebooks weren't just chilling, they provided outlines for a disturbing pattern of deliberate targeting. Many victims were specifically chosen because of their vulnerability, financial instability, loneliness, or misplaced trust. "He told me to keep track," Crane muttered, said it made each one like a chapter, chapters in something eternal, expanding the horror across cities. As evidence continued stacking up, authorities realized that Fisher and Crane's crimes weren't confined to New York City. Investigations in multiple cities began tying back to the duo: Chicago, Philadelphia, Dallas. Each case followed hauntingly similar patterns: disappearances in upscale neighborhoods, traces of bodily remains found in unexpected places, and faint connections to false aliases Fisher had used to blend in with elite circles. One particularly disturbing case in Chicago mirrored the Manhattan discoveries. A maintenance worker had reported finding clumps of hair and biological residue clogging the building's garbage chute months prior to Fisher and Crane's final flight from law enforcement. The case, initially discarded as an isolated and unexplainable anomaly, now fit neatly into the timeline of their spree. They weren't just killers, Special Agent McKenna noted during a briefing. They were parasites, feeding off the vulnerability of wherever they landed next, and every time they moved, they refined their methods. The victims, names to remember. Forensic work and cross-referenced reports eventually attached names and faces to the victims. No longer were they just fragments of DNA or unsolved missing persons cases. They became individuals with families, dreams, and stories. One victim, Kara Mitchell, was 23 and an aspiring photographer. She had met Fisher at a gallery opening in New York, where he convincingly posed as a venture capitalist financing the arts. Her mother, speaking through tears in an interview with authorities, said she had never believed her daughter wouldn't come home. "She used to call me every Sunday," Kara's mother said, "and then one Sunday, there was nothing. I told myself she was busy. I was wrong. Oh God, I was so wrong." Eventually, a memorial was established in Manhattan for the victims tied directly to Fisher and Crane, immortalizing their lives as a stark reminder of the dangers lurking behind charming smiles and false promises, unmasking the evil. For the public, the revelations surrounding Fisher and Crane's case unveiled a brand of evil that was at once shockingly intimate and horrifyingly impersonal. While Fisher's calculated business-like persona turned him into a monster with endless control, Crane's chaotic instability and warped vision of meaning added a layer of unpredictability that made their partnership all the more terrifying. "This wasn't just murder," McKenna said during a press conference. "This was manipulation at its most extreme. They didn't just kill, they invaded lives, used trust as their weapon of choice, and turned dreams into nightmares. It's a reminder that evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a suit or paints a picture." The unveiling of their crimes left a wake of heartbreak, further compounded by the knowledge that Fisher and Crane likely believed their twisted actions would leave them immortalized, not as perpetrators, but as creators of some warped legacy. "They were wrong," Jacob said. "Their names won't be remembered as visionaries. They'll be remembered as predators, as monsters, and they'll rot for what they've done, paying the price before justice." The moment Dwight Fisher and Daniel Crane were apprehended, a chapter of terror closed. But the real story was far from over. Their capture only marked the beginning of a new kind of battle, a courtroom confrontation in which the weight of their crimes would be unraveled and judged under the cold, scrutinizing eyes of the justice system. For the victims' families, investigators, and a nation horrified by the chilling details of their spree, the trial wasn't just about punishment, it was about closure. Two different men faced judgment for the same monstrous crimes, each bringing unique layers of horror to the courtroom. But as the proceedings began, one thing was clear: justice wouldn't be denied this time. The prosecution prepares for battle. The prosecution team faced a unique challenge. Fisher and Crane weren't just two men accused of murder, they were symbols of calculated evil, one the cold manipulator, the other the unhinged accomplice, both feeding off each other to evade authorities while leaving a trail of devastation across the nation. The evidence compiled against the duo was extensive but emotionally charged, and the prosecution knew they had to approach the trial with precision. Special Agent Lisa McKenna, who had led the manhunt and subsequent investigation, worked hand in hand with the legal team to piece together an airtight case. It wasn't just about presenting the facts, it was about telling a story that would hold the jury's attention, a story built on irrefutable evidence and the voices of victims no longer able to speak for themselves. "These men aren't accidents," McKenna said in a statement during pre-trial preparations. "They are predators. What we have to do is make sure the court sees them for exactly what they are, and ensure they never get another chance to do this again." The prosecution's case leaned heavily on forensic evidence: DNA from the remains found in the Manhattan drainage system, ballistic matches from Crane's rifle used during the Kansas City raid, and notebooks filled with dark sketches and details about their victims' lives. But the most chilling evidence came from Crane himself. During his interrogation, Crane had rambled on about their motives, his reluctance, and Fisher's influence, inadvertently confessing to nearly every crime they'd committed. "He didn't even realize he was handing us the entire playbook," Jacob said later. Whatever lingering loyalty he might have had to Fisher was gone the moment he started talking. 2 defendants, 2 strategies. Once the trial began, Crane and Fisher's legal strategies couldn't have been more different. Fisher, ever the calculated manipulator, appeared calm and collected in court. He refused to plead guilty, and instead leaned into the appearance of sophistication and intelligence, attempting to cast doubt on some of the evidence and distance himself from the more gruesome specifics of the murders. His lawyers painted a picture of Crane as the unstable rogue actor, claiming Fisher had been forced into compliance through threats and fear. "I'm not defending a perfect man," his lawyer admitted during opening arguments, but Dwight Fisher was not the monster pulling the strings. He was a pawn in a storm far larger than he could control. For Crane, the strategy was desperation. Initially, his legal team leaned into an insanity defense. They cited his lifelong struggles with mental illness, institutionalization, and Fisher's influence in pulling him into the crimes. Crane's behavior in court often supported this claim, as he appeared disheveled and nervous, muttering incoherent statements under his breath while refusing to meet the judge's gaze. At one point, when a victim's parents testified, he broke down in the courtroom, sobbing audibly. He said I was helping him," Crane shouted during one disruption in the proceedings. "I didn't want to, but Dwight, he said we were creating something that no one else could. He lied." But even with this emotional volatility, the jury wasn't swayed. The notebooks discovered in Kansas City disproved any claims that Crane had simply been a passive companion incapable of making decisions. He had carefully cataloged their victims, taken trophies from them, and helped orchestrate their disposal with alarming detail. The emotional testimonies. As the trial continued, the prosecution called a string of witnesses, first responders, forensic analysts, and surviving family members of the victims. These testimonies painted a harrowing picture for the court, often reducing the gallery to tears. "I told her to be careful," Kara Mitchell's mother said during her testimony, her voice shaking with emotion. "I told her these big cities are dangerous, but she said she could handle herself, and now I don't get to see my daughter grow up just because 2 men thought she didn't matter." Another chilling testimony came from a neighbor who had briefly spoken to Fisher and Crane when they lived in the Manhattan penthouse. "He acted so normal," the neighbor recalled. "He said he was in finance, always dressed nice. Not in a million years would I have thought they were doing that in the same building." The court was shocked when the prosecution projected images recovered from the notebooks, dark, grotesque sketches, often accompanied by personal notes about their victims. "Elaine, the beautiful one, looked terrified but still smiled for me." The revelations only underscored the predatory nature of their actions, not just murder, but a psychological game of dominance and degradation. The verdict. After months of grueling testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Dwight Fisher was found guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. His cold, manipulative demeanor left no room for sympathy, and he was sentenced to death. Daniel Crane, despite his emotional instability, was also found guilty of a near-identical list of charges. However, due to his mental health history and perceived influence from Fisher, he was given a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, a decision that sparked mixed reactions from families of the victims. "Death would have been too easy for him," one grieving father said afterward. "Let him live with what he's done. Let him think about it every single day." For Fisher, his sentencing was met with defiance. "It's all a sham," he claimed as he was led out of the courtroom. "You think you've won, but I wrote the story. No one will ever forget me, you'll see." But for all his posturing, the public's view was clear. Fisher and Crane would be remembered only as monsters, symbols of a darkness that had finally been extinguished. The closing of one chapter and lessons for the future. The conclusion of the trial marked a victory for justice, but the scars left on victims and their families would take a lifetime to heal. Law enforcement agencies across the nation used the case as a blueprint for future investigations, highlighting how technology, collaboration, and persistence had dismantled the duo's web of deceit. Infrastructure management in urban areas was also scrutinized, particularly in luxury housing complexes. The shocking use of a building's drainage system to conceal crimes forced cities to reconsider how such spaces are monitored and secured. For McKenna, Jacobs, and the countless other agents who worked the case, the final verdict wasn't about celebration, it was about resolution. "We don't do this for glory," Jacobs said. "We do this to make sure the people who can't speak for themselves get their say. Today they did." The criminal court's decision affirmed one universal truth: justice doesn't sleep, no matter how carefully it's evaded. And Fisher and Crane learned too late that their carefully curated lives of manipulation and cruelty could only end one way: in harsh, unforgiving judgment. Their downfall became a reminder to all that trust, while a cornerstone of human connection, can also be manipulated by those who exploit vulnerability. But when society's defenses rise, when investigators dig, when survivors fight, and when families refuse to forget, the Dwight Fishers of the world cannot escape the consequences of their actions.